Great, thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar on the FY 2020 Office on Violence Against Women Grants to Tribal Governments to Exercise Special Domestic Violence Criminal Jurisdiction. My name is Esther Librato, and I'm enrolled with the North Fork Rancheria of Mono Indians, and I'm a project attorney here at the National Congress of American Indians. NCAI is a technical assistance provider for tribes who are interested in or are currently exercising special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction. It's criminal jurisdiction over non-Indian perpetrators of domestic violence. And we work closely with our project partner, the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. And I want to give a special thank you to TLPI for helping us put this webinar together. We have, some staff who will be on the webinar today and who we otherwise work closely and will be working with all of you if you have any questions. So thank you to TLPI, and I also want to give a thank you to the National Council who is hosting our webinar today. So the subject of today's webinar, as we've mentioned, is criminal jurisdiction over non-Indian perpetrators of domestic violence, specifically a funding source that's available through the Office on Violence Against Women. So we'll be focusing on that solicitation. The two files that are available in your download box that was just mentioned, one is the solicitation itself, so feel free to open it up and look at it throughout the webinar. There's also a PowerPoint presentation. It's a PDF of a PowerPoint presentation that was given by the Office on Violence Against Women in their own pre-application information session. So those are two good resources that come directly from the Office on Violence Against Women. So today, as I mentioned, my name is Esther Librato. I'm with NCAI. Joining us as well is Chia Halpern-Vitso. She's with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. We'll also have Mr. Jim Taylor. He's a prosecutor with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes. We also have Judge Kim McGinnis. She's the Chief Judge of the Pueblo of Pewaukee. And also joining us today is Judge Cindy Smith. She's the Chief Judge at the Suquamish Tribe. So thank you to everyone who's joining us today. I'll quickly go over just an outline of what this webinar will be covering. So as I mentioned, it's focused on this funding stream. So we'll go through the solicitation itself. We will provide a bit of a background as well in terms of SDVCJ generally. Then we'll hear from our guest speakers. Each of them have actually received this funding in the last funding cycle. So they have the most current information and can share their experiences and more information about what their project looks like. And then finally we'll move into some general grant writing tips, and then might have some time at the end for questions. I will note that we will be taking questions throughout the webinar. Each segment can be complicated, and we want to make sure that we're answering as many of your questions as possible. So as was mentioned, please use the chat box to enter your questions. We'll take particular time to stop, look at those questions, and answer them. So if you submit a question and we don't get to it right away, we'll get to it as soon as we can. We also want to cover what this webinar will not include, just so that you know. So full information regarding the solicitation itself, we're going to give an overview here and highlight on some key points. But for additional information, we refer you to the solicitation itself, to the information session PowerPoint presentation that OVW did. That's, again, that second file available for download. And we'll also be able to direct you to OVW itself if you have more specific technical questions about the application. We will be covering some of the uses for the funding, but we won't be covering we'll be covering the funding available under this funding stream, but there is available funding through other solicitations, for example, other agencies or departments that could also be used to fund VAWA implementation and your exercise of criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians. And we won't be getting into sort of the realm of funding that's available. And then finally, we won't be covering an extensive look at the criminal jurisdiction itself. I mentioned we'll do an overview, but we have other resources available to dive into some of the due process requirements, for example. One of those resources is our website at ncai.org/tribal-VAWA. On the website we have, as you can see, this is a screenshot of the home page. We have a copy of the 5-year report that NCAI put out following the first 5 years of implementation. It looks at the tribe's experiences. It walks through the law itself. It tries to pull apart some of the pieces that initially, at least especially, were really confusing as it related to some of the due process requirements, jury pool questions. So I refer you to the website itself and to the report. Great. So as an overview of the law itself, so with the 2013 reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, Congress recognized and affirmed tribes' inherent authority to exercise criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians. And that does cover the conduct of domestic violence, dating violence, and violations of protection orders. So I'm sure, as many of you know, there are still some gaps in what the current law allows, but we're focused on that jurisdiction as it comes through VAWA 2013. Here's a list of all of the tribes who are currently exercising that jurisdiction over non-Indians. You can see it's a long list. We're up to 25 tribes now, and it's many tribes have been able to implement the jurisdiction, work through some of these more complicated pieces, as I mentioned. Jury pool questions, due process questions, defendants' rights can be challenging, and as I mentioned, NCAI and TLPI are technical assistance providers, and we do work extensively with tribes kind of in all spectrums, from planning stages to the actual exercise of the jurisdiction to assist in any way we can. So feel free to reach out to us at any time. And overall, we just really want to highlight that there's a wide variety of needs that can be funded through this solicitation, through the Office on Violence Against Women. And much of it, that's highlighted on this screen is trying to address some of those more complicated pieces that came through in the federal statute. So for example, to exercise jurisdiction over non-Indians, the federal law requires, effective assistance of counsel and free appointed licensed attorney for indigent defendants. And that can be really expensive. And so you can use this funding in order to bring on that counsel if you need it. Additionally, there's requirements for judges, requirements that your criminal laws, rules of procedure are all publicly available. So you can use this funding to help, whether it's through a system that you want to have it posted online, or if you want to have copies made. Moving down, the recording of criminal proceedings, that's a big one. So one of the requirements is that your proceedings you need to have a record that can, of course, be set up on appeal, but the trial has to be recorded through either audio or visual means. We've had a number of tribes who've been able to use the funding to update some of the infrastructure within their courtroom. It could include wiring, getting the cameras, or the recording, the microphones. So it's just a wide variety of needs that tribes have to meet, and that this funding can be used for. Detention facilities is another one, and medical costs, especially for non-Indians. Of course, the Indian Health Services can't cover medical costs for non-Indians, so helping cover some of those costs, these tribes have used this funding stream. Great, so we'll move on to the solicitation itself. As I mentioned, it's available for download in your files box within the webinar. The first is some background on the grants to tribal governments to exercise special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction. It was created in FY 2016. It's designed to assist Indian tribes in exercising this authority. It provides monetary and technical support for activities that range from planning, implementation, and exercising. And I think in a couple of slides, we'll really go through and see what that looks like. And our guest speakers today will each also be able to explain, that you can use the funding at no matter what stage you're at in the implementation process. And we have a link as well to the justice.gov/OVW/open solicitation, and that's where this solicitation is housed in addition to others. And then really importantly, the application due date is February 26th. So it's coming up relatively quickly, and that's why we hope to be able to do this webinar in time to answer any questions that you may have and provide that additional assistance in your application. And it's 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. So West Coast, be mindful that that's it's not 11:59 your time zone. It's East Coast time. Great. So again, just looking through the timeline for the solicitation itself, several of the dates on this slide have unfortunately already passed, but with regard to grants.gov registration, your SAM registration. If you have questions about those or if those timelines did pass, fortunately this funding stream has so far occurred every year. So if those deadlines have passed and you don't have your SAM or your grants.gov registrations up to date, work on that now. It can be a lengthy process so that you're in line to apply in the future. There's additional, it's not required, but it has been encouraged to submit a letter of registration. And then the Office on Violence Against Women anticipates notifying everyone by October 1st. So I do want to pause there for a moment to say your application is due in February. You won't necessarily find out that you've received the award until October. So it is a lengthy review process. Here's just an overview of the purpose areas of the Tribal Jurisdiction Program. The first, to strengthen tribal criminal justice systems. That can include, such a wide range from probation, prosecution, looking at detention and correctional facilities, alternative rehabilitation centers. The second category is to provide, again, going back to some of those requirements, indigent criminal defendants with effective assistance of licensed defense counsel. And if you were to look through sort of the 5-year report that I mentioned earlier, or some of the resources that are available on the website, you'll see tribes have navigated some of these requirements differently. Some have, a full-time public defender's office. Others bring in contract counsel to handle some of these cases. So again, the funding has kind of a wide swath of uses. Third also goes to some of those additional requirements that can be expensive if you want to exercise this jurisdiction. And then the fourth one, is really to the extent that you want to be able to provide additional services for your victims. If you're, mindful that when in any given hearing or especially in trial, victims might want a separate space within the courtroom, before they have to go in to testify, for example, or if they're not already in the room and listening. Maybe it's updating some of your policies with regard to, when officers respond to the scene, what information are they giving to the victims? Is it a handout that gives contact information for victim services? It's just a really wide range. And here, this slide I really appreciate this visual. It emphasizes that you can use this grant funding to just determine whether or not there is a need in your community to exercise this jurisdiction, and to go through some of these requirements, due process requirements, your jury pool questions, to really assess and plan whether or not that's something you're interested in moving towards. If you have decided you do want to exercise this jurisdiction, you can use the funding because you're sort of in the middle ground of that activities moving toward implementation to really get all the pieces in place to ensure you're all set. And then you can also use the funding to actually prosecute the cases and to detain, convicted offenders. So I also wanted to highlight some of the post-award requirements. So if you were to submit your application and receive the funding, there are some requirements that OVW, there's a wide range of requirements in terms of compliance with federal laws and regulations. But in particular for this program, one of the requirements is participation in the Intertribal Technical Assistance Working Group, also known as the ITWIG. And that's a group that meets, historically has met twice a year in person. We otherwise have a number of monthly calls, email information that's distributed, and it's a working group of, again, the tribes who are currently exercising this jurisdiction and those who are still planning or are interested in exercising the jurisdiction. And everyone comes together, shares information. It's an excellent opportunity to ask questions, and that is one of the requirements if you receive this funding. Another requirement is participation in OVW training and other technical assistance. If you receive the funding, there's a new grantee orientation to attend, and then OVW otherwise has trainings throughout the year that you'll be required to attend. You'll also, after submitting the application and receiving the award, you'll be required to submit a memorandum of understanding, and there are certain required partners that have to be a part of that MOU that you'll then submit to OVW. There also is a planning period immediately after receiving the award in case you need to make any changes to your budget or to your project scope. Excuse me, not your project scope, but to sort of fine-tune some of your project goals. There's a planning period in which you work with the Office on Violence Against Women to finalize all of that. And then this last one is if you're using the funding to prosecute or detain non-Indians, there's a separate, it's called the SDVCJ Readiness Certification, and that's actually a series of certifications. More information is available on that in the solicitation itself. I believe it's on page 5, and that is to certify that you've met all of the due process requirements laid out in the federal statute. Just a quick look at the award itself. It's a grant. The estimated total funding is $4 million, and there's an expectation OVW anticipates giving out 10 awards. We have information about the award ceilings. It is available to new and continuation grantees, and I'll have a slide about that in, I think, the next slide. The average projected award amount, $400,000. And then the length of the award period for new applicants is 36 months, and for continuation applicants, it's 24 months. Looking at the eligible applicants, Indian tribal governments that have jurisdiction over Indian country, and that over Indian country comes in especially because the exercise of criminal jurisdiction itself, the federal statute, is 25 USC 1304. And that actually part of the jurisdiction itself requires that the crime have taken place in Indian country. So the prerequisite, of course, to exercising the jurisdiction and also to receiving funding to prep for or exercise that jurisdiction. So just some kind of definitions: new applicants or applicants who've never received funding under this program. Continuation applicants have an existing award under the program. Application and submission information. Again, we have the solicitation is available for download here. The actual application package is on grants.gov. And here's the contact information if you would like a paper copy of the application. It's ovw.tribalaffairs@usdoj.gov. Looking a little bit at the components of the application itself, it consists of a summary data sheet, and we have in parentheses sort of the weight that's given to each of those pieces. That's worth 5 points. The proposal abstract is not scored. It's essentially a short summary of the project narrative itself. Next is the project narrative. That's worth 75 points. And that's broken down into 3 separate categories. So each project narrative must contain these categories, which are the initial assessment, what will be done, and who will implement, and you can see the score breakdown there. You'll also need to submit a tribal resolution or some other document demonstrating your authority to apply for these federal funds. You'll also be required to submit your budget detail worksheet and narrative, and that will really lay out, if you're seeking funding, the full amount of the funding over the full time period. So, for example, $400,000 over 36 months, your budget detail worksheet and narrative will really lay out exactly how much will be spent in each year. And then there's some additional documents that will be part of the award itself. They're standard forms. The first one, for example, SF424. I believe you download that form from grants.gov. So those are other pieces that are less specific to your project and more specific to the entity through which you're applying. This is just kind of highlighting again, looking at the application contents, there are some pieces that are absolutely required, and your application will not be considered if those pieces aren't included. And that's the project narrative, again, consisting of those three pieces: budget detail worksheet and narrative, and then the authorizing resolution. And this, kind of lays out, again, all the same content in terms of the additional documents that are needed to apply. Great. So we'll pause here for any questions. I know that was a lot of information. It all comes directly from the solicitation itself and from the PowerPoint presentation that the Office on Violence Against Women gave in their information session. So I'll pause here and see if there are any questions. Again, please feel free to enter them into the chat box. Oh, and another, we've received some requests for sample project narratives, and we have some great examples that have been shared with us that we are able to share with you all. So if you would like to email me, and my contact information will be on the last slide, but it's elibrado@ncai.org. Please reach out to me if you would like a copy of a sample project narrative. Okay, I have one question. Have any tribes asked for funding for code revisions? What is a reasonable cost? So it's an excellent question. Yes, certainly a lot of tribes have been able to use the funding to revise and update their codes, get them published online, and also look at their rules of procedure. A reasonable cost is a more challenging question, and I would defer to some of our guest speakers in case that cost is incorporated into any of their budgets. Some tribes have taken, looked at the amount of codes that need to be updated and decided to have someone who's already on staff work on revising those codes. And in that case, you can estimate that staff members, or, singular or plural, what their salary is and how much time you anticipate them spending on updating the codes. And so you can allocate it that way, or some other tribes have decided to hire someone. So they'll bring on a contractor whose sole responsibility is to update the codes. And that, would be depending on kind of the area you are in. And sort of what that looks like in terms of their cost. So I hope that answers your question. Any other questions? Okay, well, feel free to enter them. We will have additional times to ask more questions. One more question came through. Does publicly available necessarily mean available online? Another excellent question. It does not. Certainly posting your codes online is the perhaps easiest way to demonstrate that it's publicly available. But really the core of this is that you want everyone to have notice of what the laws are and what they're subject to, what the penalties are, what their rights are. So it can get a little, you certainly would want to have copies available throughout, whether that's at the courthouse itself, maybe it's at your library, maybe it's available at community events. So you would have to demonstrate that everyone has access to these laws, that they've been put on notice. And one of the easier ways to do that is to publish online, but you don't have to publish online. Okay, so we'll move into the next segment of our webinar, and again, we'll address additional questions moving forward, but I'll go ahead and turn it over to Chia.
Thank you, Esther. Hello, everyone. My name is Chia Halpern-Beetzel. I work with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and I'm enrolled with the Spirit Lake Dakota Tribe. And today, I'm just going to go over a few slides that show the descriptions of some of what the tribes have done. So this is fiscal year 2016, and these are tribes that have received the OVW grants to tribal governments to exercise special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction. And as you can see here, 6 tribes received the grant that year. And there is a variety. You'll see that there are a wide range of what tribes are doing and a range of tribes that are in various stages of planning, implementing, and exercising the criminal jurisdiction. And these projects are suited to each tribe's unique needs. The tribe, has worked hard on their application, and what they've been funded for are, very specific to what they need. So again, when you're looking at the solicitation, really think about what you need in your community, and don't feel, obligated to see what these other tribes. It's good to look to see what these tribes have done to get some ideas, but again, what you need, you let OVW know. So here you can see that, for example, Tulalip tribes, they were one of the pilot project tribes, one of the initial tribes that began exercising the special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction in February 2014. And here they used their grant funds to fund a victim services coordinator within the prosecutor's office, and also use grant funds for monitoring those who may have been let out while they're on their own recognizance or on a bond. And some of the other tribes here, as you can see, Port Gamble, Santa Clara Pueblo, and Yurok tribe really use their money for code review, code drafting, and they were definitely in the initial stages, and some of these tribes have since implemented, like Port Gamble, and some of the other tribes are still preparing to implement. So it really is a wide range of tribes out there who are in different stages. So just keep that in mind. You don't have to be prepared to implement, relatively soon. It can be used just to plan if that's what you need. This slide just goes over 6 tribes who received the grant in fiscal year 2017. So Eastern Band Cherokee had already implemented, and they were using their funds for a data collection project to keep their domestic violence offenders accountable and to ensure that victim rights were being upheld. And here, Gila River Indian Community, they used their funding for a lot of code revisions, and they have since implemented the jurisdiction. And as you can see, Comanche Nation used their funding for constitutional reform, recording equipment in their courtroom, just a variety of projects that they needed the funding for. And I don't want to get into too much detail. I would like to leave some time for the tribes that we have online, but feel free to look at later at the PowerPoint slides just to see what all the tribes have done here. Fiscal year 2018 grantees, the Pasquayaqui tribe, again, was a pilot project tribe and had implemented in 2014. They used their funding for hiring a prosecutor, further domestic violence training for their staff, as well as to cover medical care for defendants. The Rosebud Sioux tribe has used their funding to revise and review their tribal codes, as well as to develop their jury process, and as well as costs for judges and other training for their staff. And as you can see, there's a Little River Band of Ottawa Indians and the St. Croix Chippewa Indians. So feel free to look at these more in depth as you need to, but for now I am going to turn it over to Judge Taylor.
It's Jim Taylor. I'm not a judge. I'm a prosecutor.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry. I've been with the Confederated Sioux Tribes about 10 years. We're a PL 280 jurisdiction that's gone through partial retrocession. like a lot of reservations, there's a lot of land that was lost through allotment. We presently have a fairly good working relationship with the state prosecutor's office in our jurisdiction that covers most of our jurisdiction. Actually, our reservation is split up into 5 different counties, so that makes it a little problematic, but most of it is all in one jurisdiction. We're just a planning grant. The council has not made a final decision about whether they want to exercise special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction, so we're hiring a consultant to help us. I mean, what we're mostly concerned with are some of the numbers. You know, what are the extra facility costs going to be? Where are people going to be housed for long-term prisoners? What are the programmatic costs? I think a lot of the code stuff we can probably handle internally, but some of the programmatic stuff and the facility costs we just don't have a handle on. One of the benefits of complying with Special Domestic Violence Criminal Jurisdiction is also brings you into compliance with the Tribal Law and Order Act. You know, if you comply with one, you comply. If you comply with Special Domestic Violence Criminal Jurisdiction, you also comply with TLOA. So there's some real benefits to the tribe there. So it's given us a chance to take a long, hard look at the numbers, the upside, the downside. We're still really early on in the process. I can tell you the application process was pretty easy. We ended up doing just an internal MOU rather than trying to grab any external partners, just so that it's a lot easier to maintain control and get a consistent feedback on a quick basis for an internal MOU. So that's what we've done. I know they encourage you to have external partners as well, but that's what we've started with. The reporting isn't bad. The reporting, I've done one quarterly narrative report. If you use a consultant, it's a lot easier than if you use internal staff. If you use internal staff, there's a lot more involved in the reporting, but it's all online. It was a fairly quick process to get it all uploaded. Just, I think, 4 quarterly narrative reports every year, and then there are financial reports that are also due. But the financial stuff, I'm not involved in that, but it's just like any other grant in terms of the requirements of the federal government. There are a number of tribes that have exercised or that were stuck one way or opted into PL 280 that are now trying to exercise special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction. And actually, I just this couple of minutes ago emailed Esther and asked her if I could get a list of all the PL 280 tribes, because I think we have some fairly unique issues. We're only a partial retrocession tribe, so we have exclusive misdemeanor jurisdiction and concurrent felony jurisdiction over tribal members. Other tribes have gone through full retrocession. I think Tulalip has, I think Chehalis is also a 280, Yurok is also a 280. Anyway, but I think 280 jurisdictions have some sort of unique issues that they have to deal with that other tribes may not. So anyway, our goal is to, hopefully maybe by this time next year, be ready to make a decision about whether we want to exercise special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction. If we do, we're probably going to apply for continuation funding so that we can jump right into it in the fall of next year. We're trying to gather a lot of data. We were not able to gather a lot of the data that the application called for. Our own office didn't have the capability to do that. The state jurisdictions didn't have the data about racial characteristics of defendants and victims, but we're hoping to do that also through our grant, to have our consultant work with the local jurisdictions to the extent possible and get as much of that data as we can. So we would be happy to talk to anybody that has questions. I'm the primary person who's in charge of the grant till we get the consultant hired. But happy to explain to anybody what we're doing, share anything that we've done, share anything from our codes that you want. There's a ton of resources through NCAI, so encourage you to think about the process. Even if the tribe's not committed to it, it's worth exploring.
Thank
That's
you,
all I got.
Jim.
Yep.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, feel free to type some in if you think of any. Next, we will turn it over to Judge McGinnis.
Good morning. I'm Kim McGinnis. I'm the chief judge at the Pueblo Poake, which is a small tribe located north of Santa Fe. So we're about 20 miles north of Santa Fe in northern New Mexico. It's about 20 square miles, and we've been considering for years exercising or planning towards exercising special domestic violence jurisdiction. Because it's such a small tribe, there's only about 550 tribal members and about 450 who live within the reservation. I and the other folks, at the General Counsel office, we didn't really know if we would have the numbers because, of course, in tribal court we get a number of Native American people charged with domestic violence, but we don't necessarily see the non-natives because they're being dealt with outside of the jurisdiction of the Pueblo. But we finally pulled all the reports from our PD. Our Poake has its own police department, and they keep excellent records because they report to the state for data. So we pulled all the records for from 2015 through 2018, and we did finally see that there were a number of domestic violence incidents with non-native offenders, and that through this program we'd be able to take care of some of those through the tribal court. And then we also knew that with folks filing for orders of protection through tribal court, there were a number of non-native offenders who we were issuing orders of protection against, and they were violating those pretty freely because sometimes the feds will step in, but generally, unless it's a really very serious incident, the feds do not step in and prosecute the non-native offenders who violate tribal orders of protection within the reservation. So we realized that we did want to pursue that power to criminally prosecute the non-native offenders who offend against tribal members or Native Americans within the Pueblo. So the Tribal Council is very much behind doing this, but one of the problems, of course, is we just don't have the resources in-house to do the code revisions and to devote the time necessary for doing the code revisions. We have almost everything in place as far as myself being a law-trained judge. We have in the Law and Order Code already, the jury pool includes anyone who lives within the Pueblo. And there's about 4,000 people who live within the reservation, and so it includes all people, non-native and native, who live within the reservation are part of the jury pool and can be summoned for jury trials. We have recording devices already, but the thing we don't really have is law-trained prosecutors, and we don't have law-trained advocates, defense advocates. So our project is primarily about, first of all, about code drafting, including creating a victims' rights code and policies and procedures around what happens when there is a domestic violence incident within the Pueblo. Hiring a prosecutor, and our vision is that the person that we use as the prosecutor will also be the person spearheading the project, who will be doing the code revisions and working with our legal department to do the code revisions and get those through Tribal Council. Our funding is also to have a contract public defender. We don't anticipate the need for a full-time public defender, at least not initially, and certainly not during the first probably 2 years of the project while we're planning and getting ready to implement. And then lots of training for justice partners. Poake does have its own victim services project, so we will be coordinating with them. So it's an internal victim services advocate who does court accompaniment already for folks who are filing for orders of protection or are involved in a criminal case as victims. And then we do plan to establish a domestic violence docket, and that's part of how we're going to deal with who we're going to provide a public defender to, at least initially, so that will be folks who are taking part in the domestic violence docket will be having access to a contract public defender. the the key for us is creating safety in the Pueblo, and since we've applied for this special domestic violence jurisdiction, now we're actually seeing cases where we're super frustrated that we can't exercise the special domestic violence jurisdiction over non-natives because our PD is much more aware. We're creating a lot of awareness within the community around domestic violence because of this implementation and going through tribal council to get approval for the implementation. And now we're actually having folks brought in and getting civil orders of protection against them when they've committed crimes, but the only thing that the tribal court can do is to grant the civil domestic violence order of protection, and even if it's violated, we can't. There's not much we can do. We have very little power. Our PD has a really good relationship with the U.S. Attorney's Office, but it's really difficult to get the U.S. Attorney's Office to take a domestic violence crime unless there's been prior convictions or it's a really serious domestic violence crime. So that's been our frustration. One thing I think is key is, and Jim mentioned this about getting the data, is that we were able to really hone in on the data because our tribal police did keep those records really well. And I also use the census data. So you go to the census website. There's also a website called My Tribal Community, and that has demographic information broken down really in a very granular fashion for each reservation. And I think that funders really like to see that you are honing in on what is going on exactly in your community as far as number of incidents and what the demographics are for each of the communities. One of the other things that we're going to be using funding for is to ensure that people who have limited English proficiency, including the offenders, that we are able to access a court-trained interpreter, and also to have technology for people who are deaf or hard of hearing to ensure that they are able to participate fully, either as jurors, offenders, victims, witnesses, that we have, that's not going to be a barrier for people's due process rights, to ensure that they do have access to the court system through technology or interpreters. And that's all I had to say.
Thank you, Judge McGinnis. Does anyone have any questions? I see somebody typing here, so I'll just give it a moment. And again, if anyone has any questions at any time, please feel free to type it in, and we'll get to it, even if it's from a previous slide. Okay, here's the question. Does VAWA require licensed prosecutors? Yes. Yes, it does. And so does Tribal Law and Order Act enhanced sentencing. As Jim mentioned before, if you're compliant with one law, you're pretty much compliant with the other, so it's something to think about. I know some tribes have decided to implement both, or one first and then the next, but it's something to consider while you're looking at those requirements and what your community needs. I am going to turn it over.
Sorry, this is Judge McGinnis again, and
yep.
I don't believe VAWA requires law-trained prosecutors. It requires law-trained public defender and law-trained judge. But
yes, that's correct. Sorry about that. Many of the tribes that have implemented VAWA do have licensed trained prosecution. I am going to turn it over to Judge Smith right now from the Squamish tribe.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. So my name is Judge Smith. I'm the Chief Judge at the Squamish tribe. We are, I'm sure you're all aware, infamous for the Oliphant decision. So when this law was enacted, we did not want to be first in line to implement because we didn't want to end up in the federal appellate system again, So we waited quite a bit, but went to every intertribal working group meeting, and I can really say that that group is a fabulous group to attend, and even if you end up not getting the grant or choose not to apply, I would encourage you to attend because it's a wealth of information, and you hear from tribes all over the country and get great ideas about how to assist your own tribal people. So the Suquamish tribe is a small tribe, like I said, about 12 square miles on the slide. It's in Kitsap County, which is the county across the water from Seattle. So there's actually a lot of traffic through here and a lot of interaction between Native and non-Native community. We knew all along, or Tribal Council all along wanted to implement this jurisdiction, but just didn't want to be first. So the law got passed, I think, about a year ago, roughly, to implement. And of course, as soon as the law was passed, the first case came in. What I wanted to do, though, with the grant was to beef up pretrial services and probation. We have rudimentary services, but really wanted to be able to provide for monitoring, developing a risk assessment to figure out, is somebody able to be released from jail, or do we need to keep them in jail? There's quite a big movement across the country for bail reform, but we don't have any tools to really assess whether or not someone's a risk, and other than just sort of your gut or good judgment, which would be nice to have some backup for that. So we're working on that. Also monitoring folks. If they're not in jail, we'd sure like to know where they are, so having GPS monitoring. The probation department, we do a lot of things by hand around here, so they have, he has a notebook that he keeps his records in. So actually having a software program where he could update the probation check-ins, how people are doing, if they violated, the risk assessment, any needs they may have. So, and then that would be available to the court. We also wanted to take advantage of this funding stream to pay for public defenders. We do have licensed public defenders for folks who are in tribal court, but adding the non-native certainly adds additional cost to the tribal court. So we use the funding stream for that. We house folks at a jail which is approximately, it's a local county jail, I don't know, 30 minutes away. And we can transport them back and forth, but if they've been arrested and they need their bail hearing right away, to have the capacity to have a video bail hearing. So getting equipment to make that possible makes life a lot easier for everybody. And like Judge McGinnis, we wanted to fund for interpreters and also for hard of hearing to make sure that people had their due process rights and access to the court. For jury selection, that's all done by hand around here. Like the clerks get a list and they cut up the names and they put them in a basket, they draw them out by hand, and then they mail out these letters. So I'm pretty sure there's a better way to do that. So we got funding for jury selection software and trying to automate that process. And then again, because of the increased cost to the tribe to prosecute non-native domestic violence perpetrators, we have obtained funding for the cost of the jail and any medical costs that they might have. You all may have heard about the story of Pasquayaki, who was one of the first implementing tribes. And I believe, I can't remember if the person had a heart attack or a broken leg or something. They had astronomical medical costs that IHS wouldn't cover, and I think the tribe ended up paying for. And so we didn't want to be in the position of having a huge medical bill for someone who is incarcerated, so we sought funding for that. So that's our project.
This is Esther. I just wanted to jump in quickly on the point about for the medical costs and making sure and being able to use the funds to cover those costs. Just to clarify, and that is such a, exactly from that incident of it being this outrage. And I think it was some kind of either a heart attack or other issue. So it was incredibly expensive. And I just wanted to maybe put on everyone's radar, you can budget out funding for that, but it's part of your entire grant budget, and so it is kind of a question of making sure that you have those funds available if you need them, and also if you don't end up needing them, now you sort of have the funding allocated to that purpose, which is, we don't have good advice on it other than it's something to think about and just be mindful of. So I just wanted to follow up quickly on that. Thank you.
Yeah, and one thing I would add, you know, having written this, the one thing I wish I would have put in is for a project manager, because as the chief judge, I have a lot to do, and managing a grant is, I mean, can be done, but it would be fabulous to have a project manager who could be the hands-on person, and then, of course, I'm involved, but anybody who applies for this, I would really encourage you to do that.
Thank you, Judge Smith. Does anyone have any questions? I believe someone is, okay, here we go. I read that it is a common practice among state county courts to release folks because of medical costs. Have any tribes done this? Esther, I'm going to ask you.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and we will follow up on that. I know nothing's coming to mind, but Judge Smith, do you, you know, as an implementing tribe, do you have thoughts on that?
Do I have thoughts on that? I don't know
I mean,
what the state court does. I mean, sometimes we will transport people to the local IHS clinic, people that we have in jail. Obviously, that's people who can utilize IHS. I really can't answer that. I don't know. We haven't had that come up, and I don't know what they do. It's a great question.
Yeah, and we'll go ahead and we'll follow up and see if we can get additional, you know, stories from the implementing tribes. I did see there's another question. Are there medical insurance policies available to cover the costs of non-members? If so, any idea of the cost? Another excellent question, and that has been a topic of discussion among the ITWIG, I think, since the beginning, essentially. And we don't have, at least, this would be a great resource for us to develop and have available for folks is, you know, a breakdown of how tribes have decided to cover these costs and looking at, you know, if you're housing in a, you know, BIA facility, or if you have a contract with the county, or if you have your own facility and have a 638 contract, right? There's such a wide variety of detention facilities and structures, and looking at medical insurance. So excellent question, and I'll add that as a resource that would be helpful for us to develop. And then I saw, a note that MA drops automatically when a person is incarcerated. Another excellent point and consideration. So we are almost to the end of our time, and as we mentioned, we did have kind of the last segment is general grant writing tips, and I'm happy we can dedicate the last few minutes or just a few minutes to that segment, but we do want to make sure that this time is used to really be able to have a dialogue and an opportunity for all of the attendees to ask questions. So Chia, do you want to do just a couple overarching points in terms of general grant writing tips, and then we'll see if any additional questions come in, and we'll transition to those if need be.
Definitely. Again, feel free to review these later. I don't want to go into great detail. These tips are not specific to the solicitation. They're just kind of general federal grant tips. I think just one point from this slide is just remember you have a number of peer reviewers that are going to be looking at your solicitation, in addition to those at OVW who will look at it later. But just remember you want your documents to be easy to access, and don't forget those labels for for each segment, just make it easy for your peer reviewers. You want to keep them happy. They're scoring for you. You know, make it as simple as possible for them. These are just some common problems that we've heard feedback from different federal agencies. Just remember to respond to every question that's asked, every piece of information that the solicitation calls for. Make sure you answer, even if it's just short. You want to make sure your peer reviewers can, you know, they get a list of things to look at, to look for, and you want to make sure that they're able to say, yep, they provided that information, check the box, give them the points. So, and just remember, you want to draw your connection between your activities and your project narrative and your budget. Make sure they all coincide. Let's see. Sorry, I don't want to take up too much time here. Yeah, here's just some general tips. You know, make sure you apply early, review it, go back, make sure everything's consistent, especially if you have different writers for different sections. You know, let's see. Just make sure that early on you get your tribal resolution and your MOUs done. If you're not applying this year, take a look at the solicitation anyhow. It may be fairly similar next year. And if you have not been successful with your application, you can check with the funding agency to look at some of your comments and see what your strengths are, your weaknesses, beef it up for next time. Check in with TA providers. And just some general tips on writing your grants, your scoring criteria. Use all the pages that you have available to you. You don't want to score lower if you haven't addressed everything and didn't use your full amount of pages. If you get a chance, make sure you PDF everything. If you have charts and different formatting, it may be lost when the peer reviewer has to download each segment. So it's just helpful to put it into PDF. And you know, again, feel free to go back and take a look at these tips, but I want to leave room for questions.
Great, thank you. And I'll just reiterate again that last segment is general tips. It's not specific to this solicitation. So again, your primary source should be the solicitation itself and the requirements listed there. And then just otherwise, those are general tips that you can use for this solicitation and other funding sources. So we will take our last couple minutes to open it up to questions. I believe someone's typing one, but I did want to go ahead and also just give another thank you to both the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, the National Council, and a special thank you to our guest speakers today. Again, I think the best information that we can give is information that comes from successful applicants themselves. So I really appreciate the three of you joining us today and sharing your experiences. And then I think I'll go ahead and read this aloud. I know that there are some folks who called in and don't necessarily have the chat box in front of them. And just as a reminder, this was recorded and it will be available afterwards. You can come back and reference it. But so the comment was from actually one of our speakers, Jim Taylor. If anyone is looking for ideas or assistance in setting up a public defender's office, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes would be glad to help. We have a mix of licensed attorneys and advocates in our public defender office, and it has been in operation for more than 25 years. It operates on a holistic defense principles, and our defenders have also developed a risk assessment tool that tries to take in considerations relevant to Indian country. So thank you so much, Jim, for offering that. And I believe you'd also mentioned, if you have additional questions, please feel free to send them out to me, and I'll pass them along to our speakers. Any additional questions or comments for our presenters or our guest speakers? Did you have any other things you'd like to add? Okay. Well, great. Thank you so much. Again, any additional questions, feel free to contact either myself or Chia. Our emails are on the screen. And thank you so much, and good luck.